How do you feel about the future of COP? Where is it headed? Is there hope for it?
I think that it is a little bit of a farce because we're not actually achieving anything. Emissions are still going up. The fossil fuel industry is basically running the COP. I think it was Kevin Anderson who messaged me last year and said, "How's the oil conference going?"
Welcome back to Facing Future, where we explore the critical state of the planet. Today, I'm joined by Nick Breese, whose new book, Cop Out: How Governments Have Failed the People in Climate, tracks his journey from Paris 2015 to Dubai 2023, often intersecting with the founder of this channel, Stuart Scott, as well as many well-known scientists. For nearly 30 years, the UN has sponsored conferences of the parties, referring to the 197 nations who were party to the 1992 agreement in Rio de Janeiro. While COPs have come and gone, emissions have increased by 60% since 1992. CO2 levels in the Earth's atmosphere have sailed well past the 350 parts per million target to 427 parts per million today. And global heating has continued apace, adding 250 billion tons of greenhouse gases, crossing the 1.5 degrees Celsius safe boundary to an average of 1.64 C for the entire year we just experienced. This year's COP in Azerbaijan will be presided over, as in Dubai, by another oil and gas executive, Mukhtar Babayev, with promises to secure finances and an agreement to reduce emissions and increase renewable energy.
So we must all work tirelessly to mobilize the resources we need.
No mention of the restoration of nature. Welcome, Nick. I really enjoyed your book. So many fascinating stories.
Thank you, Dale, and thank you for having me on your show as well.
It's great to have you.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
Well, can we start with the COP21? Amid the clapping and smiling, was the famous Paris Accord ever really real or sufficient?
Well, I think there's one glaring hole, which is that it's the countries could sign up to it without actually having to follow through. There was no teeth in the agreement that meant that, you had to do what you said. So emissions have just continued to rise. People are moving away, nations seem to be moving away from their commitments. And we're on track for 3 degrees, I think, sort of ballpark at the moment. So I would say, personally, Paris would have been good if people had actually fulfilled their Paris commitments and tried to go for even for 2 degrees would have, bent the curve down, but we haven't. We've just continued to increase emissions. So I would say that it's insufficient because no one's actually taking it seriously. And we're living with the consequences of that.
Well, the treaties are non-binding, so that in itself makes them sort of meaningless. And nations, as you point out in your book, are bound to their national interests. And in many cases, that means there are fossil fuel companies who supply the energy. So it's kind of like they're in a bind to look good, to appear at the COP, the logo's behind you. But, what does it all result in? 30 years almost of these negotiations, and we still have nothing to show for it?
Yeah. And you see, it's very evident when you're at the COP. There are obviously many nations who are desperate for real, meaningful progress because they're losing people. Their natural infrastructure is not built for 1.5, let alone 3 degrees. So, they're desperate that we get this under control. And you'll see that their platform is markedly small. They might be given the opportunity to give a few words here and there, but generally the limelight goes to the big polluters who keep telling you how wonderful the technology is, or the new part of the agreement, how much progress we're making. And then all you do is you look at the numbers and you just see that emissions went up again. So really, is absolute garbage. I mean, Mukhtar Babayev, who's the next COP president, the presidency's vision is to enhance ambition and enable action. Well, it's basically a petro-state with an economy that's completely dependent on selling fossil fuels. So how do you balance those interests? It's extremely difficult. So I can actually I can empathize with the problem, but it's not actually going to get us out. And we can blame these countries, but really it's our countries as well, the UK, America, Canada, Australia. You go around the world, you can pretty much pick all the major nations, and we are the worst polluters. We really have this legacy of building up to where we are today.
Well, the United States is really the biggest petrostate in the world. Oh, shockingly. And yet the United States purports to be a climate leader. It doesn't make sense, as our country has contributed, I think, the most greenhouse gases of any other country over time since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. When is the United States going to be, maybe if we have a totally democratic process in this next election and the Republicans are not in charge, we might be able to actually, sign some agreements or make them binding. I wonder what would happen going forward. But the United States has been leading in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and if you go back to the Rio Earth Summit and George H.W. Bush, you could actually commend him with a degree of honesty for saying that the American way of life is not up for negotiation, because that's exactly what the actions have proven. And subsequent presidents, especially in this recent sort of last decade, at least to say, are constantly saying, yes, we are now these leaders. John Kerry turns up, and at Glasgow, rather ridiculously, after a few days, he said something like he'd seen more ambition at COP26 than he had at any previous COP. And of course, the COP itself was a complete failure. The Paris Agreement was compared to being a life support machine. So to say that that's the most ambition you've ever seen at a COP is pretty damning, and especially coming from the biggest polluter in the world. So, yeah.
Well, for a moment there, it looked like they were actually going to come to an agreement to phase out coal. And then that little word, that's what happens in these COP agreements. One little word tweaked turns into a nothing, phased down. It's like, maybe we'll do it. It was very depressing at the end. We were all like, oh, really? Even Alok Sharma was almost crying at that point, which was interesting.
I'm sure that once you take on the presidency and you're exposed to the numbers, and before, I suppose, even Al Jaber in the last COP in Dubai, he's an oil man. He's the CEO of the national oil company, ADNOC. But once you get exposed to all the science and you're meeting all these people, and these people are really looking at you with very suspicious eyes, you'd be some kind of crazy narcissist not to feel some form of we need to do something here. But still nothing really emerges because of such strong vested interests. And yet another odd part of all this is that if you look at the attendees of the COP, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Every COP every 5 years used to be a mega COP. So Paris was a mega COP. And then we had Glasgow. But what you've seen now is the COPs in between are also mega COPs. Even Egypt was meant to be tiny, but it was just as big as Glasgow. The Dubai was absolutely enormous. It was a massive event. And I would hazard a guess that a lot of people there didn't even really know that negotiations were going on, because there's this sort of trade fair bolt on to it. And it is a circus. There are parties inside the COP every single day. It is affectionately called a junket from the inside. And that's something that I have tried to give glimpses of in the book, is take people through these COPs, because there's a lot of, it is crazy once you're inside. You see people dancing, you hear loud music, you see drinks being poured, you see all this sort of bizarre stuff. And then the truth of why you're actually there is sort of in the ether. It's just, it was the only time. I think Paris was the optimistic COP in terms of the agreement being signed, although there were a lot of indigenous people crying at the end there because the Paris Agreement wasn't really that ambitious towards 1.5. It was very much focused on 2 degrees. But the least developed countries really pushed for that 1.5 to be mentioned. And I think Dr. Salim Ul-Haq, who passed away a couple of years ago, was very instrumental in all of that sort of loss and damage, the 1.5, and being a sort of articulate voice of the global south, which, I mean, there is no future climate change for them. They are suffering crazy extremes today, you know, and have been for a long time now. And it's very dangerous and sad what's happening there. And then the cops take all of this so lightly is probably my main thing.
It's also happening 100 days of 100 degrees in Phoenix, Arizona. It's 100 degrees right now in Los Angeles, and it's September. And we've had immense fires in Canada. It isn't that just the global south has been hit by these events, which, as you say, you know, warnings have turned into actual events. You know, we don't have to warn people. We just have to point to what's already happening everywhere, not just in the global south. Stuart Scott, our founder, you know, was very much always wanted to go to these climate talks, which he called the annual festival of kicking the can down the road. You know, I never understood. Well, if you realize that, why you're so dedicated to attending these events, which he really insisted upon, but he did collect a great many people into his, you know, climate show, and all of us are sort of derivative from Stuart. We owe him that debt for his dedication.
Well, I think in Cop Out, I try to pay some homage to Stuart, because he really he sort of carved his own niche out of all of these facilities, which I think other people do it now, but he was the sort of pioneer who figured out that you could take a full press conference room, which are quite often doing back-to-back press conferences with 0 people, not a great deal of interest, but really it's a TV studio. The equipment in there is state of the art.
So you're taking their mechanism for press conferences and using all of the facilities to make a TV studio.
I use the facilities that the UN provides to all NGOs, but I use them in a creative way. And I've created Climate Matters TV.
It's amazing seeing these very high-profile people marching into Stuart's talks and delivering their prognosis and marching out again. And he really made that his own. But Stuart was a famously energetic person. I at times fell out with him and then made out with him and fell out with him.
As did we all. Stuart was not an easy person to get along with. Very determined, and you know, if he had an idea, that was, you know, he was going to go and do that, which made him a great presenter in many cases. Of course, we should mention that he brought Greta, along with Ingmar Rentzhog, to the COP in Poland.
Now, I'd like you to please warmly welcome Greta Thunberg.
And that was the launch of her experience with what now is an amazing youth movement all over the world.
Yeah, you're right. It was the first sort of glimpses, I think, of this Fridays for Future youth movement that was coming to the fore. And this is another thing that I tried to bring out in the book, actually, is from year to year, you have these sort of trends that are, some are rising, some are falling. And the youth trend really appeared in Poland. I think that was the first time. And then by the time you got to Madrid, it was absolutely dominating the entire COP. So by Madrid and then Glasgow, you had these very organized, very vocal, very present, very articulate speakers. And what was particularly commendable about Fridays for Future is that they had these leaders, these very visible young people like Greta, Thunberg, but they, soon as they got the attention, they gave the stage to these lesser known people from the global south and let them speak. Or in Madrid, they noticed that the scientists weren't being given any platform, so they knew they could create a press. The press rolled in to see these kids talking, and then suddenly they just handed it over to the scientists who went through all of the things that we should have been talking about at the COP. And it was a very clever use of the platform. And I think that was kind of almost teaching a lesson to diplomats who are roaming these corridors, doing dodgy deals behind the scenes, where the youngsters are actually much more on top of how to do effective public engagement and get their messages out. So it was really impressive.
Greta famously said, "Don't try to make me this celebrity. Listen to the science. It's not. Don't listen to Greta. Who am I?" You know, it was so beautiful. You know, this very simple person. She was like, "No, it's not about me," which was a great service.
Well, I think this is purely speculation, but after Glasgow, I mean, in Madrid, you had this sort of party atmosphere. The march in Madrid was like a fiesta. It was absolutely insane. There were film stars, there's all this stuff. There was even a stage at the end, it was really kind of buzzy. And then you go to Glasgow and the atmosphere changes. It's much more gritty and people are demanding change. Very Glaswegian. People are demanding change. They're at the gates and you can hear it inside. There's this sort of tension. It's not a fiesta anymore. And then suddenly the COP relocates to places where you just cannot protest. In Egypt, in Dubai, and it'd be interesting to see what it's like in Azerbaijan. But they give you a pen. You've got this sort of enclosure which is very small, and you can protest there on a box. And if you protest outside of that allotted space at a time that they haven't told you can protest, then you can be debadged and chucked out. And that's not a very it's not safe in some of the countries. Don't have the same sort of levels of safety for speaking out or speaking against power. So you've seen almost the eradication of contrary voices at these last few COPs. So I think I don't know if that's purposeful or if it's just happens to have gone that way.
Well, I remember parades in the streets of Glasgow. XR, Extinction Rebellion, was very present there. And there was music and there was this red costumes. And at the end, all the NGOs walked out. There was this massive walkout in protest to the non-deal that had just been presented to us all. So, of course, it was right. It was during COVID. So that added a level of sobriety, I suppose. There was a big cordoned off, it felt like a war zone or something that we were in the middle of. But always, every day, there were people outside on the streets talking about marine cloud brightening. Why aren't we doing it? That sort of thing. I remember Stephen Salter was at that conference. He said, if they just spent the money they spent on all this police stuff to do marine cloud brightening, we could save the Arctic instead of this. So, yeah. Great frustrations at COPs, but still people continue to go. You're going to the next one. How do you feel about the future of COP? Where is it headed? Is there hope for it?
Well, I think that it is a little bit of a farce because we're not actually achieving anything. Emissions are still going up. The fossil fuel industry is basically running the COP. I think it was Kevin Anderson who messaged me last year and said, "How's the oil conference going?" And it basically is conference of the oil parties. Cool, but that side of it, I think, is damning. I was going to stop going a couple of years ago, and it was actually speaking again to Salim ul Haq, who actually said, look, this is the only platform that the countries from the global south, the most vulnerable countries, have to sit with the US, the UK or the EU, Australia, Japan. Is this the only place where they can be heard? Even if they're ignored, they can be heard.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
it was through that conversation that I thought, well, okay, so I am kind of going because of that. There is also this growth of a civil society forum. And I think that there is quite unique. It's a very unique space where there's a huge amount of discussion around regional efforts to reduce emissions. And this is another thing, is that although nations are terrible, the governments are not doing, they're too susceptible to lobbyists and so on. But at the regional levels, you see mayors, the C40 mayors, and these guys are really making massive gains because they've got quite a lot of power in their area and they're able to implement changes. So what you see is beneath the overall structure is these sort of regional structures are making a lot of progress. And I think that the COP is a forum for that as well. I sat in on a few sessions last year where there were people from different parts of Spain, regional presidents, which you have these sort of autonomous regions. And they were all talking about what they were doing because they are getting these, like you were talking about earlier, of the weeks at 40 degrees over 100 Fahrenheit. So they're getting a lot of this and they're building resilience. They're using regenerative agriculture. They're using, agroecology frameworks, which have been formalized through the UN. So there's a hell of a lot going on, which is actually very commendable. And it's not tackling the fossil fuel industry, which is what we need to do. We need to really dismantle it. And that should be the real aim of the COP. But as we are going into a period where emissions are still rising, the impacts are becoming very dangerous. We're locking in feedbacks. So geoengineering is now a major discussion at the COPs. And I was pretty amazed last year, actually, the young people who were engaged in this. And I don't want to say they're for it, but they are very pro-research. And there were people from Ghana, from Central America, South America, saying, well, look, if it's going to be another case where the global north tell us we can't even have research into geoengineering because they perceive it as being dangerous or whatever their reservations are, well, we're the ones who are pretty much guaranteed to get the very worst impacts. And those impacts then, it's not just the devastation that's caused, it's years of setback of regional development in those countries. They can't get past the recovery stage. So they're saying, we do want geoengineering research. And so there's many scientists saying it just won't work. But what we need is a lot more research. And 10 years ago, these conversations were not happening at the COP. So it's very, very interesting. I mean, personally, my opinion, which for whatever that's worth, is that we definitely do need more research because we're not doing the emissions reduction. But it might be that research just shows us why it won't work. And that's a scientist I spoke to last week made that point very clearly. She was Jennifer Francis is adamantly against geoengineering, but she's pro-research because she thinks that any rogue state who might deploy something without proper information should know what the implications are. And so,
well, like the stratospheric aerosols is the famous one that everybody is afraid of and everybody is talking about, putting particles in the upper atmosphere in order to reflect the sunlight. I think marine cloud brightening is a much better idea. Putting salt water, which comes back out, is a much more benign process. There are geoengineering processes like iron fertilization of the ocean, increasing the seaweed. There are people who are putting oysters in New York Harbor, for example, to recover some of the base, instead of the acidification, and to take out pollutants. Geoengineering, I mean, the biggest geoengineering project is the fossil fuel industries putting our climate totally at risk. That's geoengineering. I think in the future, we're going to be looking, there's this overshoot commission already that is looking at, okay, so we blew it. Now what do we do? And maybe that's what the future of the COP will be.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how realistic it is to think that we can overshoot and then, like a thermostat, bring the temperature back down. I think these are very hubristic ambitions, but we've left ourselves absolutely no choice but to move in that direction. And one of we talk about this in Cop Out as well. I was doing interviews with lawyers and also Sir David King, who's very involved in Paris, the Paris Agreement, about how would you govern a global geoengineering project? Because solar radiation management at the global level probably would work. I don't mean, who knows what would be the actual outcome, but if you wanted to cool it, it does look like it would work. So how would you govern that? How would you do attribution if there's big problems? If you accidentally wiped out a whole nation, which, what's the compensation? How do you, and everyone, the people I consulted all said, well, you'd have to go to the UN Security Council, which is basically appropriating a war body to deal with disputes around geoengineering. So I mean, this is I think that's the direction of the COP. I think the COP needs to be, and these are actually discussions that are interviews that are in the book. But the COP needs to be probably brought down from thousands of delegates to people in a room who can have one objective, which is to reduce emissions fast in a way that's equitable and safe, or whatever they decide. But then they actually achieve it. Whereas what we've got now is a circus, and we're all kind of actors within it, and that's the reality.
Well, Cop Out is a really interesting book. It's a very enjoyable read, especially for viewers of this channel who follow some of our people: Paul Beckwith, Peter Wadhams, of course, Stuart, and I love. That you stop off for coffee just as we're getting just so upset, and then you have a glass of wine and a beer with somebody, and there's this very collegial feeling that kind of relieves the pressure of the information. It's a wonderful and really interesting read, and I really encourage everybody to get a copy of it. It's really well worth reading. I think you'll enjoy it. So thank you, Nick.
Very much.
It's wonderful to have you here.
There has been some criticism of the United States, but I must tell you, we come to Rio proud of what we have accomplished and committed to extending the record on American leadership on the environment.
I still believe that the biggest danger is not inaction. The real danger is when politicians and CEOs are making it look like real action is happening when, in fact, almost nothing is being done, apart from clever accounting and creative PR.
Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing, global temperatures keep rising, and our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
As part of this grand and sacred system, harmony with nature must be maintained. The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth.